right, well, welcome everyone. My name's John Lustra. I'm the Director of Education here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by James Gindlesperger here today. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much, John.
And today we're going to be discussing his excellent book, recent book, Bullets and Bandages, the Aide Stations and Field Hospitals at Gettysburg. It's going to be a great discussion. It's a great book. And this is a very small detail, but just right down to the paper. It's just good quality paper. Just everything about the book is wonderful, and I'm
Publisher
excited.
did a great job.
Wholeheartedly agree there. You can get this book either in our museum store or we have an online store. If you can't make it to the museum, you'll find links for that in the video description below. Quickly before we begin, if you want to support our videos, go ahead and hit the like button. That helps us a lot. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you want to take your support one level up, sign up to become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. That supports great programming like this. So with all that said, we're going to go ahead and get into it here. So Jim, why don't you tell us and the viewers a little bit about yourself and how you came to the study of Civil War history and medical history here?
Well, my high school history teacher would tell you I didn't really like history that much in high school, but I did acquire a healthy interest in local history in Johnstown because of the floods.
Sure.
My grandfather was a survivor of all three of the major floods, so you can't live there and not enjoy some history. So it just kind of through assimilation, and then it went on into when my daughter was in college. She was home doing a project recording information off of Civil War headstones, because of course we all know they're starting to erode away, and
right.
and
Father
we're going to lose them. Yep.
Father Time's undefeated.
Yep, we're going to lose them. So that was one of her class projects in college.
Very cool.
So while she was doing that at a local cemetery, I was just kind of wandering around, and I found a grave of a local Civil War soldier who had been involved in the escape out of Libby Prison, the tunnel. And that kind of got me started, and began doing research on that and going to the National Archives, and kind of triggered something. And then I did got a little more interested in my own family. I found I had we call him Uncle Albert. I think he was kind of a distant cousin or something, but
Uncle Albert does kind of roll
yeah,
off the
yeah,
tongue.
it does. It's a lot easier than saying my third cousin twice removed. But he was an officer in under Custer. Didn't make it to Little Bighorn. He was out of the Army before that because of wounds. But I began doing some studies under him, and it just kind of went from there. And I kind of became a history buff by default through that. And Civil War, of course, was the main thrust of it. My wife, Suzanne, and I had been going to Gettysburg for probably 25 years or so, half a dozen times a year, and we just love it. And then we started going into places like Antietam and Fredericksburg, and now we're hooked.
Yeah, that'll do it. And
Yeah.
and I love that. I think this is common for a lot of people. It starts locally, close to
It
home.
does.
You know,
It does.
It's sometimes it can be harder to care about things that are not
Yeah,
in your regular orbit.
I agree.
But when it is made kind of personal for you like that, I think
Absolutely.
that's such a key thing.
Yep.
So. Now, what inspired you specifically to write about aid stations and field hospitals at Gettysburg? How did this book specifically come about?
Well, this book came about through my wife, Suzanne. It was her project. We were out on McPherson's Ridge one day, just kind of hiking around as we do, and she commented that, there are not many books written about field hospitals. And we really weren't aware of any specific at that point, although we found out about Greg Coco's excellent book, Vast Sea of Misery.
Right, which you can also find in our bookshop
There
here.
you go. Unfortunately, Greg's no longer with us, but Greg and I had done a couple book signings together, and he had reviewed some of my earlier books, and we had a bit of a friendship. Didn't know him real well, but I knew him well enough that I knew I liked him. And we found his book, and we started just kind of researching that for Suzanne's purposes. She was going to write the book, and it grew. It just
Sure.
grew much bigger than we thought it was going to be. We knew about, what are there, maybe 20 or 25 hospitals with the blue signs out front. That was a good starting point. And we thought, well, Greg has some in his book, and we'll just put them together and maybe come up with a couple dozen, maybe 3 dozen or so. And it turns out we were just scratching the surface. And it just became so big that Sue started to think, this is going to take over for the things that she was working on. She's a quilter. She likes to do a lot of quilting. She was researching books on, or information to do a book on Civil War quilts. And this kind of took a back seat, and she said, I think I'm going to drop it. And we decided that rather than drop it after all the research we had done, that I would take it over. And she didn't want her name on it because she didn't do any of the writing, so I dedicated the book to her, as well as Greg. Greg was kind of the pioneer of field hospital research, and I couldn't ignore him.
Sure.
So that's how it all started. It wasn't my idea to begin with.
Yeah, well, that's how some of the best ideas come
I think
about.
so.
It's
I think so.
Collaborative work like
Yeah.
that. And I also love that you and your wife are a real dynamic duo. When it comes
She's
to
a big
this.
help. Well, she's my research partner and my social director and travel agent and everything else that goes in with all
the
that.
important stuff there. That's great. Well, and it's especially amazing a battle as well written about as Gettysburg, that there hadn't been more work in addition to
That did
to
kind of
what
surprise us,
Greg had done.
yes.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. So, I'm certainly glad that this book exists. Now, once you were kind of getting into the meat of this, working on the research, how did you identify these hospital sites? Some of the field hospitals, I mean, some of them, they already had the little marker on them, but, I can imagine it was challenging, especially for some of the aid stations, which are, by their very nature, pretty temporary.
Yes.
What was that process like?
Well, it really wasn't a process. It was hit and miss. We knew where we wanted to start. We started, of course, with what we knew,
Sure.
Greg's book and the hospital signs. And we went to the Battlefield Archives, where we ran into an invaluable resource in John Heiser, the park historian, who we've become very close friends with since then. John, we didn't have to ask twice for any information. He knew right where it would be located, and we'd have it in minutes. He would bring it out to us. And a lot of that information just directed us in another direction, and we would take that information. We ended up at the Adams County Historical Society.
Sure.
We went to the courthouse and checked deeds. We went to the state archives in Harrisburg and got information. We talked to park rangers, battlefield guides, but probably, certainly the most interesting resource we used, and one of the most valuable, were the people that live in Gettysburg.
Sure.
We would always ask them permission to take a picture of their farm or their house. I didn't feel comfortable or ethical just snapping a picture of somebody's house.
Sure.
And only one case did an individual turn us down, and he did it very graciously, explained that he had had vandalism and he just didn't let anybody on his property. He allowed us to take pictures from where we were standing, which was a distant shot. But he didn't want us to go in, and we understood that. But everybody else opened their doors with, just wide open. We had people invite us to stay for lunch that we had never met before. We had a tentative timeline to do this kind of stuff, and it went out the window almost immediately, because we'd think, well, we'll be in here in 5 or 10 minutes, we'd take a quick picture and leave, and it would be 3 hours later, because we'd have to go through the house with them. And I shouldn't say have to, we really didn't want to leave once we got in there.
Right.
You got to see the blood stains on the floor in the dining room, because that's where they did the amputations, or over here by the barns where we buried them, and the arms and legs were buried over here in the orchard. And it was just fascinating, and people were so gracious and so proud of what they had, and they were very conscious of what they owned, and they were very responsible with it. And they were just invaluable. They would bring out family records and diaries and things that they had in their family for decades, and that information was just invaluable.
Hmm. Wow, that's that's pretty
It,
incredible.
it was, as my wife and I have agreed, it's probably the most fun research we've ever done, and we've done a lot together, and this was really enjoyable.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's encouraging certainly to think about people that have these pretty incredible homes
Absolutely,
who really seem to be in the spirit of knowing the history and sharing it and
absolutely.
all that. That's wonderful.
And for anybody who's interested, I have no doubts that we didn't hit every possible aid station because most of these were in family homes and farms, and they just did what they had to do. They didn't bother keeping records, so you're going to have to find them through strange means.
Hmm.
And,
Yeah,
and we did find a few that I didn't include in the book because I couldn't confirm
sure.
anything. Obituaries where the person that died said, "I grew up in a house that was a field hospital." Maybe, maybe not, but you
Right.
can't put that in a book. So there's another book out there for somebody else who wants
Sure.
to try it. So,
Yeah, so this is, although excellent, certainly not the last word.
exactly,
As always, there's more to
much more to
say.
do.
Yeah, well, I always love asking people about what sources they consult. So I mean, I think sometimes when people get a book in their hands, it sort of belies everything that went into it, and
Yes.
just reading the book,
Right,
certainly you wouldn't know
right.
that you all had been around town and been to all these places and gotten to know the people. I mean, I just think it's always so interesting for people to learn. I mean, on one level, they know the book doesn't just emerge from
Yeah,
someone's
yeah.
head, but yeah. So the Adams County Historical Society, the um, Gettysburg National Military Park archives, and just the people around town. I mean, any other sources that were
Well,
useful for this?
park rangers and battlefield guides.
Sure.
Over the years, we've come to know many of them, and just through conversations, they tipped us off about a lot of things. Found out, very surprisingly, through a park ranger, that the Eisenhower Farm uh, was not necessarily, I wouldn't call it an aid station because it was just kind of a passing through point for the
Sure.
armies, but learned that when the Eisenhowers were getting ready to move in and they were doing the refurbishments of the house and so on, that Mamie was having a rose garden put in, and they found remains where the rose garden was
Hmm.
to be. So she very graciously decided we would move the rose garden and let them lay there.
Hmm.
Places like that, it was just unbelievable the things that are available that you just kind of run across by
Sure.
accident.
Sure. Now, obviously, this is pretty building heavy in
Mhm.
here, but do you have any sites that were, because at least when I tend to think of like a field dressing station, I'm imagining it kind of like our field dressing station gallery here at the museum, which is based off a site at Gettysburg, where the 32nd Massachusetts, I think it
Up at the
is,
Loop.
kind of just
Yes,
a cluster of rocks. I mean, did
yes.
you identify places like
Well,
that?
that's the classic one that we all
Sure.
know about. They were very mobile,
Hmm.
so it was hard to pin them down because they moved with the army.
Sure.
Wherever and most of them are regimental. Those
Right.
quick pop-up ones, and wherever the regiment went, the surgeon went with them. So there are very few places that are actually identified as aid stations on the field anyway.
Mhm.
But you could almost pick one and say there's probably somebody treated here.
Sure.
Just
This rock's pretty big. Someone probably was
absolutely,
behind it.
absolutely.
Mhm.
And of course, most of the farms, um, they may have started out in the barn or the house, but the overflow, they ended up in the barnyard
Sure.
and places like that. So you're almost walking very close to an aid station somewhere, wherever you are on the battlefield.
Yeah, that's a great point because I mean, especially the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Upwards of 50,000 casualties,
Hmm.
most of those wounded. There's just physically not a lot of space for them all to be.
Right,
So they
right.
by their very nature have to be all over the place.
Yes.
So that's a really interesting perspective. It'll probably change the way I think about walking around the battlefield. You're never very far
You can't
from an
be.
aid station.
Yep.
Yeah, you can't
You
be.
can't be.
That's such an interesting perspective. I can't believe I've never even thought about it
Yeah.
that way. Um, well, I want to highlight a few specific stories. Are there any particular stories of aid stations or field hospitals you wanted to highlight? Um,
I have a bunch of them.
well, yeah, there's a whole slew of them. I want to give people maybe just a taste of some of the things they
Prob-
might come across
yeah,
in here.
probably my favorite story um, comes from the Jacob Kime farm, and I was tipped off by that by a friend who's a battlefield guide, Rick Schrader.
And Rick is great. We've worked with
Rick,
him on the YouTube channel
Rick
before.
lived not far from us, and we spent lots of time in his library and in his dining room table.
Right, because Rick is based in Johnstown
Yes,
too. I
yes,
can't believe I didn't
yes.
put that together. Anyway.
So Rick, one of Rick's ancestors was Jacob Kime, and he tipped us off to this story, and it was about well, back up the whole thing. The Kimes had to leave their farm because the battle was very close by, and Confederate officers warned them that it was not going to be safe for them. So they left the farm, and Jacob Kime came back that first evening to see how the farm fared through the fighting.
And where is the farm?
It's out on Harrisburg Pike. Right,
okay.
Actually, it's right next to the Gettysburg High School.
Okay, so a bit north of town.
Right, but you can drive right past it and not know it because
Sure.
it's just a field now. Everything's gone.
Okay.
The house and the barn are no longer there. But when he came back, the farm had been devastated already, as most of them had been.
Sure.
The fences were all torn down for firewood, and his cattle had been butchered because they had to eat, and their bodies strewn everywhere and body parts. And they went in the house, and all the linens and the blankets and the curtains that had been used for bandages, and it was just a mess. There wasn't much he could save. So he spent the night in the basement of his house. And he said he didn't sleep because all he could hear was the men upstairs just screaming in pain and calling out for some kind of painkiller, which didn't exist. And the story goes on into one of the soldiers who had been killed and buried on the Kime farm was a young man named Macleod from Georgia. About 2 years later, Macleod's, he had been buried by his manservant or slave named Moses. And about 2 years later, Moses came back to Gettysburg with Colonel Macleod's brother-in-law, John, to disinter Macleod's body and take it home. And when they got home, it illustrated, to me anyway, the impact that war has on families, particularly mothers. They got Macleod's body home for burial, and his mother said, he's been buried in the ground by himself for 2 years. He's never going to be alone again. She said, I'm not going to allow him to be reburied until a family member dies and they can be buried together. 7 years it took before somebody else in the family died. So for 7 years, Colonel Macleod laid in his parlor.
Yikes.
And she was dedicated, obviously. And ironically, the person who died was John, his brother-in-law. And the two of them then were buried in the family cemetery that she finally allowed her son to be buried.
Wow.
Very poignant story.
Absolutely.
And there are hundreds of them like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
In every war.
Yeah. Any other story in here? I mean, you were at the time we're recording this. You spoke with the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable about human interest stories and talking about it. It really kind of puts a face on the war. A war that sees upwards of 700,000 deaths. I mean, the numbers can, after a while, kind of go in one ear and out the other. But
yeah, it does. You get calloused.
Exactly. So I think these are compelling, and there's a number of those in the book as well. Maybe share another one or two of those with our viewers.
Okay. Well, one that I wouldn't say haunted me, but it stuck with me for a long time. The David Stewart farm out on Fairfield Road. It's now a campground.
And that is, I believe, west of town, right?
Right.
Got it.
And we had gone out to the farm again to talk to the owner to see if we could take a picture of the house and so on. And we always seem to have impeccable timing. If there's a bad time to do something, that's when we'll do it. We got there on Bluegrass weekend at this campground. So we stood in line, or parked in line, behind all these RVs and camping trailers and so on for about half an hour, working our way toward the gate. And when we got to the gate, of course, we just had a car, no trailer or anything. And the gate attendant kind of looked at us a little suspicious, what's going on? And we explained what we were doing. I said, I'd really like to talk to the owner if we could, and I understand he's very busy today, so if you can't do it, that's fine. And he says, no, I'll call him. So we were directed to park over by the barn and get out of the way, which we did. And the owner came out and explained that his great-great-grandfather, I may miss a couple greats in there, but had been the owner of the farm at that time. And he told me that he had seen in his grandfather's notes and diary about a 15-year-old soldier from Georgia who had been shot in the eye and had lost his eye and, of course, died on the farm and was buried in the orchard. And it was a very interesting story, and I thought, wow, that's really kind of morbid, but interesting and at the same time. And I couldn't find anything to corroborate that, and I thought, should I use it or shouldn't I? And I decided I wouldn't use it because I just didn't feel comfortable putting something in that I couldn't say this is true.
Sure.
So in the course of our research and other things, I kind of pushed that aside, and we found the papers of a surgeon from New York at the battlefield archives. And I was reading through those, and he said that he had been the surgeon for this particular New York regiment, and when he checked on many of these wounded in this particular farm, which he thought was the farm next to the Stewart farm, he said he would come across a young man, and his description, he said, I thought it was a little girl at first. He said he didn't shave yet, he was so young. And he said, and I took the cover off his face and saw he had no eyes left. He had been shot through the eyes. And bells started to ring.
Right, pretty jarring.
And he explained how the treatment went, and he said the young man died and was buried in the orchard. And everything kind of clicked.
Sure, yeah.
And the only thing that was different was that he had the wrong farm, and the two farms butted up against each other. So I thought, well, from somebody from New York that doesn't know the area, that's easy to do. And the stories were so close and so coincidental, I thought, it has to be the same person.
Sure, you would think.
So I did put it in the book then. Maybe I was looking for a reason to put it in because I really liked the story, as sad as it was. But I thought 15 years old and killed in battle, just can't grasp that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but yeah, there is a haunting element to it as well. And a great point, a researching point in there is that it's key. It's really important to remember that the overwhelming majority of anyone that fought in really any Civil War battlefield or battle had never been to that place in their life before.
Exactly.
And so, you always need to, when you're reading these kind of post-war accounts, or even reports written at the time, especially, they don't necessarily know what they're talking about when they're talking about geography.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a great point. And another little tidbit of your story made me think of, we've worked closely with the Gettysburg Foundation, which runs the Spangler Farm. And they had mentioned that on the Spangler Farm they have an orchard there as well, that it wasn't uncommon for the bodies to be buried in the orchard, since they typically don't plow the orchards.
Right,
so that also just makes sense on that level as well, which matches what I've heard elsewhere. Yeah, that's a pretty remarkable story. And one final point about eye injuries in the Civil War. We actually did on our YouTube channel, if you want to know more about eye injuries in the Civil War, did a program with a modern-day ophthalmologist about treatment today of eye injuries versus treatment then. It was one of the more exciting programs that I've been a part of, so I'd encourage you to take a look at that if that's of interest to you. Well, Jim, why don't you share maybe one final story as we kind of start to come to a close here.
Okay, well, as I say, there are a lot of them, and I could hold you here for a couple of days talking about it.
I'm sure.
One that I did kind of like, it was semi-humorous, I guess, but the way it unfolded, took place on the Blocker farm David Blocker.
And again, just for our viewers, where is that in?
Well, it's Barlow's Knoll.
Sure, okay, that's what I thought.
Had been
so.
called Blocker's Knoll prior to Barlow's Knoll. Out on Table Rock Road is where the farm is. And it had actually been a headquarters for the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry prior to the battle. They were out there on picket duty, and they were, of course, driven off by the Confederates in the first day's fighting, and it became a Confederate field hospital. Number of burials on the farm again, and of course, when the battle was over, they all left, and the wounded went. The wounded who could move went with them. Those who couldn't ended up at Camp Letterman and then on to general hospitals. But those who passed away, who were killed, were buried on the Blocker farm, and David Blocker maintained those graves for several years. Another Georgia, for some reason I'm hitting on Georgia here, and it's coincidental. An officer named Winn, W-I-N-N, from Georgia, was also buried on the Blocker farm, and David Blocker did maintain the graves. The Winn family came to retrieve the body and take it home, and David Blocker said, "You can't have the body unless you give me $10 for my trouble for maintaining the grave." Now, $10 doesn't sound like very much until you compare it to 2021.
That's not an insignificant
right.
amount. It's not a huge amount, but it's...
Well, it turns out to be a fairly significant sum. In fact, I put a table in the appendix. Because of that, I kept reading all these people complaining, and they were filing claims for $40 and $50. Well, why are they going to all that trouble? Not realizing that how much $50 was. So you can compare figures in the appendix. But anyway, he wanted $10 to get the body back, and they began negotiating. And Dr. Rufus Weaver, who was the son of Samuel Weaver, who was significantly involved with repatriating the remains of Southern soldiers, getting them home. When his father died, Rufus Weaver took over. So they involved Dr. Rufus Weaver, who negotiated the price down to $5, and Blocker said, "Well, okay, I'll go with $5, but I'm keeping the lower jaw because it's got some gold teeth in it." So kind of macabre. So anyway, Dr. Weaver was able to talk him out of that, so the Winn family did get the intact body to take home. But unfortunately, that was kind of the mercenary aspect of it. There weren't too many situations like that. There were a few. A farmer, probably well known for this. Many farmers used their wagons to haul the wounded to aid stations and field hospitals because many of them couldn't walk. One particular farmer used his wagon but charged each man 50 cents to take him to the hospital. And to make it a little more mercenary, he made them all sit up no matter what their weapons were or wounds were, because he could get more in his wagon if they sat rather than lay down. So no matter how badly they were wounded, they had to sit in his wagon and pay him 50 cents. But those were few and far between. There were a few others, but most of the people opened their farms and their homes up. When you think about it, they had never seen a bullet wound. Didn't know, their only medical experience maybe was delivering a calf.
Sure.
So they really had nothing to draw on, and they opened their farms up because that's where they were needed. And learned quickly, and the women became nurses, the men became nurses and doctors, and the residents of the area just did a yeoman's effort.
Absolutely. Well, that and they didn't really have too much choice.
Didn't have much choice. They opened the barn, and there was a bunch of guys laying there.
That's just where the wounded were, and
That's
it's
where
not
they
like
ended
they
up.
can go too far. Yeah, well, and just incidentally, upon consulting the very helpful table in there, $10, about $200 in modern money. Yeah, you know, that's the reality of war. Sometimes it brings out some unsavory things. Well, I mean, unsavory outside of the fact that people are being shot constantly.
Right.
It's you know, make no mistake, war is not a glamorous thing, and all you need to do is study medical history for about 5 minutes before you discover that point. And what these stories and this book I think really does a great job of communicating is that while the Battle of Gettysburg happens over 3 days in July, really the ramifications of that stick with the people in
Long
the
time.
area for months and months, years, and in some ways even still to this day.
Absolutely.
People, less grim and gruesome, but in a very literal sense, tourists come, year
Yeah.
round to come and see the place. So
Yep.
it's a remarkable story. Well, lastly, obviously this book is now out there in the world, and if someone picks this up, what is your hope that what do you hope people take away when they get the book?
Well, the easy answer to that is to remember.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
We tend to look at these as tourist attractions, amusement parks, if you will. Think about what happened. The monuments were put there most often by the men who fought and survived in honor of their comrades who died. Many times they want to commemorate what they did there, what happened right on that spot. And I think it's important for us to look at that and remember why we're there. It's not just for our amusement, not just to get away for the weekend. It's history, and it's important history.
Absolutely. And this is an important, especially given our mission here at the museum, it's an important, kind of postlude to, any and all battles. So thank you so much for coming in today, Jim.
Thank you for inviting me, John. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, this was wonderful. I hope you all enjoyed it out there. If you did, go ahead and hit the like button. Subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel. Stay up to date with all the programming that we do. If you want to get a copy of the book, you can find the link in the description below. And if you want to support us even further, consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You get discounts in the gift shop, free admission at the museum, and all manner of other benefits. So, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. All right. Splendid.